My name is Danny Siegel, and today I'm going to be doing the topic analysis on the NSDA topic, more specifically the NAFTA topic analysis for the NSDA tournament in 2018. Before we get started, I highly encourage everyone to check out Champion Briefs, as well as our institute that's going to be located in Florida, New York, and Texas this summer. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be there. So, let's dive into this topic. So a little bit of background on the NAFTA topic. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's composed of 3 different countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It was enacted in 1994 during the Clinton administration. What I think is really critical about having background knowledge on this topic is it was legislation passed by Congress. Why is this important? As it means the president himself, more specifically, President Trump, can't just simply pull out of the agreement. He has to get approval by Congress. So that means that we'd likely be seeing a reform NAFTA rather than simply us being pulled out. And because of the way the resolution's worded, the United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement, it's likely the current North American Free Trade Agreement is how we're actually looking at this topic, rather than looking at a world without NAFTA. Something really important about it, NAFTA itself is a pretty controversial trade agreement. I think we can see that by disputes on both sides of the aisle. I mean, we have the Bernie Sanders supporters who believe that NAFTA needs to be reformed or free trade needs to be reformed overall, as well as people who are Republicans who see free trade as not necessarily beneficial as it holds in the status quo. So I think it's likely President Trump will have this at the top of his agenda going into later in 2018. I'd be surprised if not by Nats or during Nats we don't see tweets coming from the president about NAFTA and meetings with the president and other high-up officials in Canada and in Mexico about this trade agreement, as I think President Trump and his cabinet see it as critical that they do something related to this issue in order to win independent votes going into 2020 and helping them in the midterms in November this year. So the goal of NAFTA when it was elected was to eliminate trade barriers between the 3 countries. Now, this generally means the removal of tariffs or simply taxes on imports into countries. Free trade advocates argue that this is disadvantageous to economies, as it means that they have to pay higher prices for goods such as aluminum, such as automobiles, such as many different crops that come from Mexico and Canada. Now, it didn't simply remove tariffs altogether at once. Rather, NAFTA allowed for this to take place over a 10-year period of time, or eventually after 10 years, all tariffs were removed, and this was a gradual process. So now that we have background on what NAFTA is and some of the aspects of NAFTA by both Republicans, some of the aspects of what both Republicans and Democrats believe about NAFTA, let's go into strategies, framework, and dissect the topic itself. So again, the topic is resolved on balance. The benefits of the United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement outweigh the consequences. So let's dissect the topic. On balance, what does that mean? Now, we've had this phrase used a lot on different topics. Generally means holistically. It generally means that we allow for some harms to occur, and I think this might lead to an aft skew. The reason why I think that is most economists and most people agree that free trade is generally good. Rather, it hurts some localized industries and harms some wages in an economy, which I'll get around to how I think you can work around that on the neg later in this topic analysis, but keep that in mind for the time being. So let's look a little bit further into the topic. The phrasing of the topic participation, so more specifically, on balance, the benefits of the United States participation in blah, 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 blah. That means that you can have extra topical impacts. And what do I mean by that? That means impacts unrelated to NAFTA. You can have argumentation that rely upon the precedent of the United States pulling out of certain trade agreements, the precedent of what occurs in terms of the global community when they see the United States taking actions against the interests of free trade, which is generally something that hasn't happened really in the past, or at least in recent history. It means that you can have a lot of impacts that are unrelated to NAFTA's trade agreement itself, but rather impacts like political disadvantages of what occurs in Congress or what occurs by the United Nations or other actors that are unrelated to impacts to Mexico, United States, and Canada with the with any type of economic argumentation. This allows for a lot more room on the negative, I at least think, in terms of what you can do and what you can impact out to. It allows them to link into the on-balance debate a lot more as well. So now let's talk about what I think people are going to be impacting out to on both the affirmative and the negative. The affirmative is generally going to probably advocate for NAFTA simply being good, as that's what most literature generally says on the topic, as it helps lower class and middle class Americans or Mexicans, as well as Canadians. Why do I think you should be impacting out to lower class / middle class Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians? Generally because on scope they make up a majority of these countries, which means that you are linking into the most amount of people possible as you can on your side. Not only that, but on magnitude, they're affected a lot more by price volatility of products since they have less disposable income, which is really important as it means that pulling out or reforming would impact them the most, which means it doesn't really matter what happens to the corporations, but rather the corporations' prices that they're providing. Let's talk about strategies on the affirmative on this topic. So let me start out by saying what I said earlier. Most economists agree that NAFTA is in fact good. I think the most recent survey was in 2012, and it said that 95% of economists think that NAFTA is beneficial to the United States holistically. And they use the word holistically, which I think is really important as it links into the on-balance debate very well. And I think that's how you need to be viewing this on the affirmative. Instead of disputing possible harms to NAFTA, if the negative team is reading an argument that's like, NAFTA harms Mexican agricultural markets, you can simply be like, okay, you're right. It does harm Mexican agricultural markets. Like, no free trade agreement is perfect. However, I think it's important to note that, like, in later years, those Mexican agricultural markets got a lot better, or how many Mexicans it actually took out of poverty during the period of time after that. Looking holistically at topics is important, as it allows for you to have a lot more fluid argumentation and be able to concede certain arguments rather than simply always end up in a card war on on any specific topic. Many people, more specifically, why is free trade good, or what do you need to know about free trade to be able to evaluate NAFTA? So free trade is just this general idea that we should have an unregulated international market. It's impossible to really regulate an international market, so the only type of regulations that can really come are on individual countries, which is harmful to the rest of the world, as it means their products are not shared with everyone else, which means that there are less overall products. International economists generally agree that free trade is good and advantageous to everyone. Why? This is because free trade allows for developed economies to get access to new markets. When you have an economy that doesn't have tariffs, it means that you can sell these new technologies, it means you can sell your crops, it means you can sell any product you're simply creating within your nation, and that allows for not only more tax revenue, it allows for more profit for corporations, which leads to more jobs, business expansion, etc., etc., and it's generally helpful to lesser developed nations as well. This is because they get access to generally new products, new technology, and new corporations or businesses that otherwise they wouldn't have had access to, because they now have access to some of the biggest technological or any type of firm available, which leads to foreign direct investment and plenty of other benefits, which leads to them having more tax revenue, which leads to them having more jobs, leads to them having businesses which help poor citizens get access to food to feed their families, buy luxury products or simply anything that allows for the development of their nation. Another reason why free trade is good that is outside of the realm of simply economics is diplomatic soft power, or the ability for greater international legitimacy abroad. Generally, the creation of trade agreements leads to neighboring countries becoming closer friends because they rely on one another for certain products. It also leads to less overall war, some might argue, because if you're trading together, it means that you're unlikely to attack another, because attacking one another would lead to you no longer receiving their products, which is why many international economists argue that free trade will bring about peace and prosperity for all if all regulations were brought down by governments. I think the best thing you can do on the affirmative is to be as general as possible, not necessarily talking about specific industries, as, like I was explaining earlier, specific industries were harmed, but long term they ended up making more money, and they ended up making more money, and it led to the creation of new jobs in other sectors of the economy. So simply economic benefits arguments are probably more beneficial on this topic than saying contention one is the agricultural market. Having fluid impacts, I think, is really beneficial, as it allows you to move around throughout the topic and throughout the debate, and not necessarily be stuck to advocating for this specific industry is benefiting, but rather the United States as a whole is benefiting and impacting out to poorer Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians. Now let's talk about why NAFTA might not necessarily be good. Let me start out by saying I think NAFTA being bad is a lot harder debate to win, but I think the way the topic is worded allows for you to have a lot more room, right? Like, what does NAFTA specifically do? How does it hurt those industries? And what industries getting hurt is probably the best strategy that you want to answer, or those are probably the questions you want to answer when you're on the negative on this side. I think you have a few options in terms of framework on the negative, and we talked about these a little bit earlier. The thing you could do on this side is you could be a little bit creative and say negative world is not necessarily a world without NAFTA, but rather a fairer trade agreement or a different trade agreement. And I think you can use what we were saying earlier about how Congress in fact passed it. And because Congress is generally pro-free trade, it's unlikely they just simply pull out, but rather renegotiate the trade agreement. I think this argument is a lot more probable in the current political climate, as I think radical steps by Congress are unlikely to be made, and I think we've seen that in many different ways. I think something you can use for precedent on this is Trump's dispute / sort of trade war with China that everybody was freaking out about a few weeks ago is really good evidence to use towards what might happen specifically with NAFTA. And a little bit of background information on that. Trump simply said to China that they were going to be implementing tariffs on U.S. goods coming in, or on Chinese goods coming into the United States, which would significantly harm their profits. So China simply backlashed by putting tariffs on their own products, and it led to this kind of like trade war-esque, except none of the tariffs actually ended up getting passed. They were all really threats. But what did materialize, I think, in terms of this trade war is China essentially, I guess you could argue, lost the dispute and said that they would be buying significantly more U.S. products as long as they didn't implement these types of tariffs. Why is that important? It means that even though these tariffs didn't necessarily get implemented, it still led to positive benefits to the United States, as it led to China relying on us more, because really Trump's end goal was a lower trade deficit, which in fact having a lower trade deficit, some might argue, is advantageous to the United States. And this applies to NAFTA, as it means that Trump might actually be successful in renegotiating a NAFTA and bringing Mexico and Canada to the negotiating table like he did with China, where many economists and many journalists disagreed with Trump's decision and thought that it would just lead to an overall trade war with China. It actually led to China relying on us more and a lower trade deficit for the United States. So I think that's a really interesting thing to look into, and using that as evidence to how renegotiating NAFTA might not necessarily be the worst thing. I think it gives evidence that renegotiating NAFTA might not necessarily be the worst thing. It might actually help the United States, as Trump has been successful in past, not necessarily renegotiating trade agreements, but encouraging countries to buy more U.S. products and helping trade at least become a little bit fairer and more helpful to the United States. This means that what Trump might do in terms of NAFTA might actually work, and I think having a lot of knowledge on this dispute will help negative teams quell the fears of affirmative teams that renegotiating NAFTA would lead to serious harms and lead to an actual pullout, as well as the thing we were saying earlier in terms of Trump can't actually pull out of NAFTA alone, but rather he has to get approval by Congress since it was passed as legislation. However, it's important to note you can always bite the bullet too and just say NAFTA is bad and talk about those specific industries. How do you link into the on-balance debate when you're just talking about specific industries and not necessarily impacting all to the United States? If you can prove that the magnitude of the people suffering from NAFTA's deflation of wages, harms to the environment, or even pushing out small farmers in Mexico, the magnitude of the impacts of all of those arguments are so large that it outweighs the scope of the amount of people that are being affected, then that could technically mean, on balance, NAFTA is not beneficial. So what I mean by that is if you have, the whole United States suffering a little bit more in a world without NAFTA or a world with a renegotiated NAFTA versus like 50 or a few million people who are suffering a ton, or who are helped a ton by renegotiated or pulling out of NAFTA, then technically on balance in terms of magnitude, you're helping the country holistically, as those people are no longer suffering as much. And we can go into more specific argumentation why wages might be harmed in a world in which you have NAFTA. Generally, it's just because of greater competition, right? If you remove tariffs and you have a greater workforce and companies are more willing to go from country to country, it means you have greater wage deflation as people are competing against one another, and companies can simply just go to Mexico to pay lower taxes in their economy and offshore their company entirely. In terms of hurting the environment, many people argue that NAFTA encourages the use of fossil fuels, as it means that you have to produce greater products for more countries, which is somewhat problematic, as it means that greater pollution takes place, which is a great way of linking into lives. There are many other ways you can link into the environmental harms as well, by simply how NAFTA subsidizes certain fossil fuel industries. Another way you can link into the harms of NAFTA is by specifically focusing on small farmers, both in the United States and Mexico, as now they are no longer providing food to these three nations, but rather big corporations really benefit out of NAFTA, as they are the only ones who have the means/resources to provide large amounts of food to these new markets, which is somewhat problematic as they become monopolistic, which means an increase in the price of possible goods. It also means that these corporations can pay, well, these corporations are generally paying their workers much less, which means that the smaller farmers end up getting absorbed by them, making less revenue, or it simply means that the smaller farmers go out of business, which leads to millions of jobs being displaced. Like I said before, there's a ton of flexibility on this topic on both sides. I think it's going to be a great debate. I hope everyone going to nationals does really, really well. I'm going to wish good luck to everyone. Again, I'd encourage everyone to check out our brief online, as well as check out our institute this summer, championbriefsinstitute.com. I hope to see everyone there, and I hope this video topic analysis helped a lot. Thank you so much.